The sharp reek of cordite and pulverized steel chokes the morning air as a single armor-piercing bomb fractures a battleship's magazine. It is 6:20 in the morning, Hawaiian time, December 7, 1941. 183 aircraft of the first wave, launched from 6 fleet carriers 230 miles north of Oahu, execute a master class in preemptive strike doctrine. The operational objective is achieved with clinical precision. Over 1 million pounds of ammunition detonate inside the USS Arizona, claiming 1,177 crew members in minutes. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma capsizes under the weight of 9 torpedo strikes, trapping 429 men in the dark. As reports of this tactical triumph reach Tokyo, naval staff officers erupt in celebration. Yet the architect of the strike sits in profound silence. He knows a mathematical truth his subordinates do not. "75 million tons of steel versus 7 million. A precisely calculated 13-to-1 industrial disparity defines the geopolitical board in July 1941. The United States pumps over 1 billion barrels of crude oil annually, while the Japanese Empire must import 80% of its petroleum to survive. The vast majority of those reserves are drawn directly from American wells. President Franklin Roosevelt freezes Japanese assets, triggering a coordinated total oil embargo by the United States, Britain, and the Dutch government in exile. This is a direct response to Tokyo's military occupation of French Indochina. Overnight, the strategic calculus of the Pacific Theater fundamentally shifts. The economic supply lines are severed, starving a war machine already drained by 4 grinding years of combat operations in China. On the tactical level, Japan possesses a sharp, temporary edge. The Imperial Japanese Navy fields veteran aviators with an average of 700 flight hours, hardened by years of active deployment. Their American counterparts log a mere 150 hours. This localized superiority creates a fatal illusion. Tokyo evaluates the operational readiness of its fleet and sees a specialized force capable of executing a rapid, paralyzing blow. They analyze the geopolitical parameters and conclude they are backed into a corner where diplomatic concessions equate to imperial collapse. The macroeconomic reality dictates a far colder equation. An empire without fuel is a military apparatus operating on borrowed time. Every single day the embargo remains in effect, the operational range of the combined fleet shrinks. The decision-makers in Tokyo face a rapidly closing window to utilize their highly trained strike forces before their reserves vanish completely. War planners calculate they have mere months to secure new resource nodes in the Dutch East Indies. A mathematical countdown begins, measuring the lifespan of a nation's military capability drop by agonizing drop. While the mathematics of industrial production heavily favor the United States, the strategic architects in Tokyo base their entire operational calculus on a profound psychological misjudgment. They do not miscalculate the tactical viability of a preemptive strike. They fundamentally misread the national character of their adversary. To the Imperial High Command, the American Republic appears as a fractured, war-weary democracy, inherently incapable of sustaining a protracted conflict of attrition. Observing the intense isolationist debates within Washington, Japanese intelligence concludes that the American populace lacks the fortitude for a high-casualty overseas campaign. The prevailing military doctrine dictates that a sudden, precise blow to the Pacific Fleet will fracture American morale. This kinetic shock is designed to force Washington to the negotiating table, prioritizing domestic stability over the defense of distant territories. This strategic posture is not formulated in a vacuum. It is deeply anchored in a 36-year-old historical precedent. In 1904 and 1905, the Japanese Empire engaged the Russian Empire in a direct contest for regional dominance. At the Battle of Tsushima, the Imperial Japanese Navy systematically dismantled the Russian Baltic Fleet. That decisive tactical victory compelled a vastly larger global power, governed by Tsar Nicholas II, to concede defeat and accept a negotiated peace. Tokyo projects this exact operational template onto the geopolitical reality of 1941. They envision a modern Tsushima in the Pacific, confident that a comparable military shock will yield identical diplomatic results. The fatal flaw in this strategic architecture lies in the comparative baseline. War planners construct an intricate military operation on the premise that Washington will react with the same political resignation as a crumbling monarchy. They confidently build their survival strategy upon a fundamentally flawed psychological profile, waiting for a political collapse that will never arrive. I can run wild for 6 months to 1 year. After that, I have no expectation of success. Admiral Yamamoto delivers this precise strategic forecast to Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe in 1940. As the primary architect of the combined fleet, Yamamoto intimately comprehends the industrial metrics that his civilian and military superiors choose to dismiss. He submits a formal strategic assessment, guaranteeing a vigorous offensive capability for the initial phase of a Pacific campaign. He explicitly states he possesses zero confidence in the Empire's survival if a conflict extends into a second or third year. This is not a passive critique. It is a cold, statistical projection derived directly from the comparative data of steel and petroleum production. The Supreme Commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy places the exact blueprint of their impending collapse on the planning table, a full 18 months before the first strike aircraft launches toward Oahu. Yet the Imperial High Command systematically compartmentalizes this fatal prognosis. Driven by the severe, immediate pressure of vanishing resource reserves, the leadership in Tokyo treats a long-term strategic death sentence as a viable trade-off for short-term tactical survival. The ruling military apparatus functions under the rigid assumption that an early, paralyzing strike will force Washington to seek a negotiated settlement before the critical 6-month window expires. They review Yamamoto's timeline not as a definitive warning of industrial exhaustion, but merely as a strict tactical deadline for securing territorial objectives. The entire war plan is thus constructed upon a conscious, institutional denial of logistical reality. The data is present, the calculations are verified, and the timeline is firmly established by their top naval mind. How does a meticulously disciplined military structure convince itself to actively ignore the explicit logistical limits defined by its own Supreme Commander? What drives a nation to choose a mathematical impossibility over a diplomatic retreat? While envoys in Washington exchange final memorandums, the mechanical reality of the Imperial Japanese Navy dictates an irreversible momentum. It is late November 1941. Tokyo faces a binary strategic crossroads. They must either execute a full withdrawal of military forces from French Indochina and China to restore the vital flow of petroleum, or maintain strict radio silence and propel a massive strike force toward the Hawaiian Islands. The Imperial High Command evaluates the geopolitical board. To retreat from the Asian mainland signifies the total collapse of a decade-long expansion project, a political impossibility for the ruling military apparatus. The alternative demands initiating direct hostilities against an industrial superpower. They select the kinetic solution. 6 fleet carriers, laden with precisely calibrated ordnance and fueled by rapidly depleting oil reserves, slip into the desolate waters of the northern Pacific. The operational orders are locked. Once this armada crosses a designated longitudinal threshold, the diplomatic option is permanently severed. The countdown to December 7th accelerates through the cold mechanics of a nation choosing combat over capitulation. The strategic architects in Tokyo finalize their calculations, wagering the entire existence of the empire on the flawless execution of a single morning raid. They convince themselves that neutralizing the United States Pacific Fleet at anchor will secure an unbreachable defensive perimeter. This barrier is intended to allow their land forces to extract critical resources from the Dutch East Indies without American interference. The ships sail further east, closing the physical distance to Oahu. An empire constructs its survival strategy by committing its finest aviators to a mathematically flawed equation, hoping to erase a massive macroeconomic deficit through a localized tactical victory. 82-0 in the Senate, 388-1 in the House of Representatives. December 8, 1941. The foundational assumption of the Imperial Japanese High Command disintegrates in less than 24 hours. President Franklin Roosevelt addresses a joint session of Congress requesting a formal declaration of war. The anticipated political fracture of the American Republic never materializes. Instead of forcing a war-weary democracy to the negotiating table, the preemptive strike acts as a unifying catalyst. The isolationist movement dissolves instantly. Representative Jeannette Rankin stands as the singular dissenting vote. She is a solitary statistical anomaly in a government that instantly transitions into a monolithic war machine focused entirely on total systemic retaliation. This is the precise strategic pivot of the Pacific theater. The psychological calculus formulated in Tokyo collapses. The United States does not calculate the cost of a negotiated peace. It immediately authorizes the rapid mobilization of its dormant industrial base to pursue unconditional surrender. The geopolitical board expands further on December 11th, when Germany officially declares war on the United States, linking the European and Pacific conflicts into a single global equation. The localized tactical victory at Oahu achieves nothing but the awakening of an untouchable macroeconomic force. The timeline of the Japanese Empire's survival is now fixed. A conflict designed to be brief and diplomatic transforms immediately into a protracted war of industrial attrition. This is the exact scenario the Imperial Navy lacks the capacity to sustain. Back in Tokyo, naval staff officers raise glasses of sake, celebrating the precise execution of their operational objectives. Yet the Supreme Commander of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, spends the day sunk in profound, silent depression, watching his subordinates toast to a victory that guarantees their own destruction. At 15,000 feet above the Central Pacific, the mechanical drone of American dive bombers pierces the scattered cloud cover. It is June 4, 1942, exactly 6 months minus 3 days since the preemptive strike at Oahu. The United States Pacific Fleet, guided by intercepted signals intelligence, engages the Imperial Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway. The strategic counterattack targets the specific vulnerability Admiral Yamamoto previously identified. Over the course of a single afternoon, American aviators systematically dismantled the core of the combined fleet. Armor-piercing ordnance penetrates the wooden flight decks of the fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and eventually Hiryu. The resulting secondary explosions from ruptured aviation fuel lines and armed torpedoes completely consume the vessels. 4 capital ships, over 250 aircraft, and more than 3,000 personnel are eliminated. Critically, this casualty figure includes over 200 of their most experienced, combat-hardened pilots. This is an irreplaceable human asset that required years of active deployment to cultivate. In exchange, the loss of the carrier Yorktown and 1 single destroyer is recorded by the United States Navy. The mathematical prophecy delivered to Tokyo in 1940 materializes with clinical accuracy. The strictly defined 6-month window of unhindered operational superiority expires on this exact date. The Imperial Japanese Navy is permanently stripped of its offensive projection capability. They are forced into a reactive, defensive posture across the entire Pacific theater. the localized tactical advantage built upon veteran aviators evaporates, replaced immediately by a grim logistical reality. The strategic board is forcefully reset. The ensuing phases of the Pacific Campaign will no longer be dictated by complex naval maneuvers, but by the relentless, untouched capacity of manufacturing plants located thousands of miles away. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States manufactures 354,000 combat aircraft. In direct parallel, the Japanese Empire constructs exactly 76,000. The naval disparity is equally stark. American shipyards launch 147 aircraft carriers, while Tokyo completes exactly 18. The conflict transitions entirely from tactical fleet maneuvers to a strictly macroeconomic equation. American shipyards operate on a continuous, uninterrupted loop, producing 22 Essex-class fleet carriers while launching 3 new Liberty ships every 2 days for 4 consecutive years. The industrial sectors of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle systematically replace combat losses exponentially faster than the Imperial Japanese Navy can inflict them. The logistical disparity that defined the strategic landscape in 1941 now dictates every operational outcome across the Pacific theater. By mid-1944, during the American counteroffensive at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, this material supremacy merges with a fatal degradation in human capital. Japanese aviation forces are fed into a highly efficient, mechanized attrition zone. In exactly 48 hours of combat, over 600 Japanese aircraft are eliminated from the sky. The United States records the loss of 123 machines. This localized destruction is the direct result of a collapsed training pipeline. The veteran aviators who executed the Oahu strike are gone. Their replacements are deployed into active combat zones with a mere 40 hours of flight training. They are ordered to engage American pilots who enter the theater possessing a minimum of 525 flight hours, flying technologically superior airframes. The strategic miscalculation made in Tokyo reaches its logical conclusion. The military apparatus of the Japanese Empire is systematically dismantled by an untouchable industrial supremacy. As domestic fuel reserves run dry, the daily production metrics slowly count down toward a definitive, inescapable mathematical zero. By 1945, over 50% of the entire world's industrial production takes place strictly within the borders of the United States. The preemptive strike at Pearl Harbor was executed flawlessly as a tactical military operation. Yet it rested on a fatal psychological assumption. Tokyo gambled the survival of an empire with 73 million citizens against a continental powerhouse of 132 million, betting entirely on a perceived lack of American resolve. The Pacific conflict was not decided by localized bravery or brilliant naval maneuvers. It was a macroeconomic equation solved the very moment the first bomb fractured the morning air over Oahu. The Imperial High Command initiated a war of attrition they mathematically could not sustain. The precise, confident plan formulated in 1941 achieved its immediate objective, only to awaken an untouchable manufacturing titan. History demonstrates that tactical perfection remains irrelevant when the underlying strategic calculus is built upon a profound misjudgment of the adversary.